All right, hi everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight for our live discussion. We've been having some powerful conversations since the beginning of 2020, and tonight I'm certain it's going to be no different. So I want to welcome all of the members of Purpose Diaries. You guys know you have my heart. Of course, I want to welcome no stranger to you all. We have been discussing this book for the past 2 weeks. My co-host, Miss Elaine, say hi.
Hello, everybody. How are you? Good to see you again this week.
Good. And of course, our special guest for tonight, Richard Stengel, the author of the book we've been reading, Mandela's Way. Hi, Richard. Welcome. We're so happy to have you tonight.
I'm so happy to be here, Krisha. Thank you. Thank you to Elaine, too, who discovered it.
I know. We were just sharing earlier that the story of us doing this book. I actually started off January in my group wanting to talk about vision. And after we spoke about vision, Elaine said, Krisha, we have to read this book. Like, I think this is a great book for us to follow up with. I'd never read it, but I trust Elaine. So I said, yes, let's do it. Richard, let me tell you, when we started to read this book, I'm like, girl, I love you for recommending this.
That's wonderful.
I want Elaine to really share first about her encounter with the book and what made her recommend it as a read for us inside of Purpose Diaries.
Yeah, so guys, a few years back, I was working in retail at Bloomingdale's, a store, it's a luxury retail store. And I was managing a couple of departments there. And at the time, the current CEO that at Bloomingdale's recommended the book Mandela's Way, and he actually made it a mandatory book for all of the managers to read it. So at first, anytime somebody says mandatory reading, you're like, ugh. Like, what do I have to read now? But I was, a little apprehensive of mandatory reading. But once I started reading it, I was like, man, this is so good. I've always obviously had high regards for Nelson Mandela and everything that he represented in his life. But to see that he wasn't just, a historical figure, he was like a real person with real stories and real life lessons. And that's, those two things put together is what really took to me. And I was like, we have to share it. We have to read it together. And it's a great book to have discussions around because it allows you, to open up to certain topics, to just look at internally at what people are. And it's just a great book. And I thought that, everybody here at the Purpose Diaries chat is just amazing. And I just wanted to discuss it all together and share it with everybody.
Good. I want to thank you so much for the discovery and then sharing it with us, Elaine. And I want to read a little bit of Richard's bio, but of course I shared it with the group. But I must say, the first question I had, Richard, was how does he find time to do all of this? Because it was so extensive and it was so much. I usually like to talk, from my heart, because as a speaker myself, every time people ask for the bio, I'd be like, don't share it, because I feel like it kind of intimidates the reader sometimes. So I want, because when people hear all these things, they're like, ooh. And I want to share a little bit from my heart. Of course, the first time that I reached out to you would have been through the website. And I mean, such a warm welcome. I told Elaine, I said, he actually responded. Because sometimes you're not too sure if people would buy into the vision that you see for others. And it really was about exposing the group to a different level of information, about us hearing your mind, about us hearing what it was to actually walk through pages of history and write this book, and hearing about you as an individual. So I want to just let you go without me reading this bio, because I've shared it with the group. I just want to let you feel free to just open, to share, to greet the group, to greet everyone on Facebook, and just tell us about Richard and this journey.
Well, thank you, Krisha. I mean, when you reached out, you were obviously so delightful and lovely, and said all the right things, and I was very happy to participate in this. I love Nelson Mandela. He changed my life, and of course, he changed the life of millions and millions of people. But he changed my life very directly. I remember once he said to me, "Many people love me from afar, but very few people love me from up close." And I did have the opportunity of loving him up close for the time that we spent together. When this project came about, it happened in a funny way. I was a young writer at Time magazine, and I had written a few years before a book about South Africa called January Sun. I'd gone down there and wrote about what was known as a forced removal, where a white town was moving the black township away from the white areas, which was one of the themes and kind of evil practices of apartheid. And I wrote a book about that. And there's a publisher named Little Brown, and they had signed up Nelson Mandela about just a few months after he came out of prison. And the publisher of Little Brown was a man named Bill Phillips, and he was having lunch with a fellow named Dick Stolley, who was then the editor of People magazine, which was a sister magazine to Time. And People had just reviewed my book, and they were having lunch because Phillips wanted to find somebody, an American journalist, who could work with Nelson Mandela on his autobiography. And at that lunch, Dick Stolley handed him my book, January Sun. And that night, Bill Phillips stayed up all night and read it. And he called me up at 8 a.m. the next morning to offer me the job of working with Mandela on what became Long Walk to Freedom. And of course, it was an offer you couldn't refuse. And it did change my life. I went down at the end of 1992. He'd been out of jail for about a year, and we started that project. I also met my wife on that project. My wife was a South African photographer. Yeah, I met her in the first few weeks I was down there. So Nelson Mandela really did change my life in a wonderful, wonderful way. It's very daunting to meet Nelson Mandela for the first time, and he really is I talk a little bit about it in the book. I mean, he was a magnificent man. I mean, he was about 6'2.5" and incredibly handsome and charismatic and big head and big hands, and it's sort of like meeting a dream figure. And I think I told the story of when we first met. They had kept me waiting. That was the early days of the ANC before they were in power. It was very disorganized. I mean, an organization run by mostly men who had been in prison for 10, 15, or 20 years and only finally had been let out. And at any rate, to make a long story short, when I finally got in to see him, he said, I guess we chatted for a few minutes, and he said, I guess after a few sessions like this, you'll have enough for your book. And I had been pent up waiting for him. And I said, Mr. Mandela, if you think we'll have enough for a book after a few sessions like this, you're crazy. And I pointed at him, at which point his assistant, Barbara Masekela, came in and grabbed me by my shirt and led me out. And I thought the whole project was over. And I begged to have her let me come back and see him. And a couple of weeks later, I went in and I apologized to him. And I don't know why I said this. I said, Mr. Mandela, I'm so sorry about the other day. I'm sorry I was so brusque with you. And he burst out laughing and he said, if you thought you were brusque with me the other day, you must be a very gentle young man indeed. And we both started laughing. He had a lovely, wonderful sense of humor. I mean, he'd been in prison for 27 years. Me calling him crazy was not exactly going to be hurtful to him. So that started our relationship. And he had the most lovely manner and temperament, and I, ended up, of course, doing a tremendous amount of research into his life. And in a strange way, the prison experience was the sort of crucible that made him into the man that we saw. This mature man, this temperate man, this man, his greatest praise of anyone else was that they were measured. He was very measured. But he talks about how when the man who went to prison, he was 72 when he got out, he was 46 when he went in. And he said the man that went into prison was not measured and was not did not have a great temperament. He said, I was a rabble rouser. He was giving fiery speeches. He was kicked off the podium. He then went underground and started the Umkhonto we Sizwe, which was the military wing of the ANC. And what happened to him in prison was that it gave him self-control. Because in prison, he said, the only thing you could control was yourself. You had no control over anything else. You didn't control when you woke up. You didn't control the clothes you wore. You didn't control your time. You didn't control what you ate. The only thing you could control was yourself. And he learned this kind of massive kind of self-control. I remember when we used to do our interviews, I would put a little microphone on his shirt before we taped it. And I remember when I would put the microphone on him, I had never seen a human being be so still. He was like a statue. Again, it was part of this prison experience. I remember going to Robben Island, where he was for the lion's share of his time in prison. It's this beautiful island off the coast of Cape Town. And it was a torture for them because they could see the bright lights of Cape Town at night in the distance. And I remember being absolutely stunned and shocked when I went into his cell, because his cell was tiny. I mean, it was like a closet. I mean, I'm about 6 feet tall. He's 6'2". I couldn't lay down in it. He couldn't lay down in it end to end. So in a way, it was just like this kind of thing forced him to have this kind of extraordinary self-control. But the other thing that prison taught him, which was just sort of amazing too, and has to do with, I think, his DNA as a human being, is it actually taught him empathy and sympathy for his jailers and his enemies, right? I mean, anybody else would become bitter. And it's not that he was, had no bitterness in him. I mean, he lost 27 years of his life, the best years of his life. It destroyed his family. But he also realized that if he came out with a feeling of vengeance and he came out wanting to punish people, he would never save his country. And he had to save the country for everybody. His great goal was democracy, one person, one vote. And remember, in South Africa, Black South Africans were the majority of the population, 85% of the population, and they were disenfranchised by this white minority. So, but he felt for South Africa to really succeed, he had to bring the whites and even the very conservative whites in the Nationalist Party into this new dispensation. And he had to do that by trying to understand them. So one of the things he did in prison, which was just sort of amazing, is he taught himself Afrikaans. Afrikaans is the language of the whites, of the majority of whites in South Africa who were Dutch immigrants. It's a kind of Pidgin Dutch. He taught himself that. He read books in Afrikaans. He memorized Afrikaans poetry. He would talk to the jailers in Afrikaans rather than in English, which they weren't good at. It gave him a sense of empathy for the people that had imprisoned him. Now, so when he came out, his message was, let's forget about the past. Let's forget the injuries that we've done to each other. Let's move to this new democratic country where we can work with each other. I mean, it was really an amazing and extraordinary message, and an extraordinary message for the world. And I think at the moment we're living in now, and this is something I mentioned to Krisha, I have a new book out now called Information Wars, and it's about I was worked for President Obama in the State Department and combating disinformation. And one of the things that we've seen around the world is this rise of authoritarian strongmen, of leaders who are weaponizing the grievances of people who feel left out and mobilizing people against immigrants and doing all kinds of things that don't reflect the true power of democracy, which is the rule of law and fairness and equity for all people. And Mandela is a fantastic counterpoint to that, right? He's a man who suffered immeasurably. I mean, he was in prison for 27 years. He lost his family. And yet he came out without a feeling of vengeance or a feeling of hatred, like animate these leaders that we're seeing around the world. He came out with a feeling of, let's figure this out, and empathy for his enemies. And it's a great lesson in our time, because we have too many leaders with this kind of authoritarian tendency who are wholly without empathy for anybody but the people that support them. You know, Nelson Mandela created a country for white and black and brown not just for his own people or even his own tribe. And it's a fantastic lesson for our time. And unfortunately, there aren't enough leaders like that anymore, and there aren't enough people like looking at the example of Nelson Mandela. And even though he was, a little bit headstrong and a little bit stubborn, he would change his mind. And one of the things that I find so disheartening about so many leaders today is that like they're afraid to change their mind. I mean, I remember he said, "Well, when circumstances change, I change my mind. What do?" He wasn't afraid to do that. It's leaders with a sense of confidence who can change their mind and say, "You know what, I thought this before, and then I learned new information, or the circumstances changed, and now I think this, and I think you should too." That's a very, very powerful thing. And we see too few leaders able to do that. This sort of my way or the highway ethos was not what he believed in. In fact, he grew up in a remote part of South Africa called the Transkei, and his father died when he was 12 or 13, and his father was sort of the like the viceroy of the prince of their tribe, the Tembu tribe, and the prince adopted Mandela when he was 13, and he went to live in what was known as the Great Place, which was where the prince lived. One of the things that's interesting about the Transkei, and some of the recent biographers of Mandela have noted this, is that he grew up in an area that was 100% African. That area had never been conquered or even reached by the English colonial power. So he grew up in a world of African leadership. He was inspired by African leaders from, the last century and the Middle Ages, and he was taught that. And the African style of leadership is a little different, as he would say, than Western style of leadership. And he observed how the prince led. And even though he was the prince of the people, in his kind of executive council, he would listen to absolutely everyone speak before he said anything. And the prince only spoke at the end, and then his job was to summarize what was said before and try to find a path that united everybody. It's a different style of leadership than Western's leadership, and certainly than the my way or the highway. It was an egalitarian style of leadership. It was a leadership that was based on compromise and seeing things from the other person's point of view. And he took that with him all of his life, and he showed that when he became president of South Africa. And in fact, one of the most astonishing things that he did after becoming president of South Africa was he decided, I'm going to be a one-term president. He was, I think, 76 when he became president. He said, I don't want to be an octogenarian president. And on a continent where, leaders, male leaders, have often stayed until they were carried out, it was a great lesson. He said, the people should elect a leader. I shouldn't stay here just because I want to stay here. And it was a very, very powerful thing. In fact, it was very similar to what George Washington did in the United States when he was the first president. There were no term limits. At the end of his second term, he said, I'm retiring. I'm going back to the farm. That's what democracy is about. You have to find a new leader. So that was one of the many examples of leadership that Nelson Mandela showed.
Wow, I was sitting here trying to listen and take notes all at the same time. I love that you said that his life gave him the discipline that he had as a leader, talking about his prison experience and how so much of that experience, I mean, when you explain to us what his prison cell looks like, I started to picture this 6'2" man in this little closet that he could even fit in, yet instead of having hate and animosity, he came out trying to understand the people that he was about to serve. And I think that's an incredible lesson.
It's a fantastic lesson. And when he came out of prison, he made a point of visiting the families of his guards, who were mostly white Afrikaans men. He visited the widow of the president of South Africa who started apartheid. I mean, he wanted people to see that he could see the other side. And part of, what part of what a lot of bad leaders do is they mobilize people's fears. I mean, the white South Africans were afraid, and he was telling them, "Don't be afraid. We want to make this country fair for everybody," and he did. It's funny. After he left office, there was still there's tremendous amount of animosity between black and white in South Africa, and his great friend and ally, Archbishop Tutu, who was also a Nobel laureate, basically started something called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was this public commission where people testified, and it was televised, and people confessed to what they had done in the bad old days of apartheid, whether it was imprisoning people or killing people or punishing them, and they got a kind of absolution. It was it's an incredibly powerful thing that I think countries can do, and too few countries can do, because unfortunately, in so many places, people are still animated by their grievances, and they're more about trying to get vengeance rather than trying to get fairness for everybody.
Wow, that's amazing. One of the quotes that I wrote down that you touched upon was, the liberation struggle was not so much about liberating Blacks from bondage, but it was about liberating white people from fear. And I can see the paradox with what's going on in politics today, that instead of keep that fear away, we're kind of bringing fear back, and it's dividing our country. So I don't know if you want to share some of your particular ideas about that, or how Mandela would have handled that.
Yes, I think Elaine, that's exactly right. I mean, I think unfortunately, so many leaders around the world, and unfortunately in the United States, the president of the United States is using fear to get support. I mean, when Trump ran for office, he exploited people's fear of immigrants. And in fact, of course, it's usually in places where there were no immigrants. They just had this kind of inchoate fear that wasn't balanced by any actual knowledge. In places where there are lots of immigrants in the U.S., there's tremendous support for immigrants and for giving citizenship to immigrants. It's in places where there are not, and Trump exploited that fear, the fear of the unknown. People who are afraid are also afraid of terrorism. The less informed voters have a greater fear of terrorism than more informed voters. And unfortunately, a good leader tries to educate people, whereas a bad leader tries to keep people in ignorance. And when Mandela said that it wasn't just liberating white and black, it was liberating people from their prejudices, that's an enlightened form of leadership. And that is the kind of leadership we should have around the world and having in the United States. And unfortunately, we don't.
I particularly really enjoyed the fact that he knew that people were not being rational. So he said, I'm not going to try to rationalize with people that are not rational. So he tried to appeal to the emotion, to the heart. And that's why you said he learned the local language, he learned their language, and he even used the sport of rugby to
Yes.
connect with them. And so I think that, as young professionals, we can definitely use this, because many times we could be in a situation at work or working with a particular customer that that you cannot rationally get to them. But
Yeah.
How do you appeal to them as a person? How do you appeal to get past the unrationality of it? Because sometimes people just cannot get through it. So what do you, maybe you can give us some tips.
Yes. So the story that you mentioned, Elaine, of the story of the rugby story, which was turned into that terrific movie with Morgan Freeman playing Nelson Mandela and Matt Damon playing the great South African rugby captain. I'm forgetting the name right now. It had that Latin name from a poem that Mandela liked. We'll think of it. But what Mandela realized is that some of the animosity of white Afrikaners towards him and towards blacks just was irrational. And he decided, how I can appeal to them? I can appeal to something that is in their hearts, which is the support for the South African rugby team, the Springboks, as they were known. And the Springboks managed to get into the World Rugby Championship. And on the day of the game, right before the game, Nelson Mandela dressed in the South African rugby uniform and the number of the character that Matt Damon played, and walked out onto the field and gave a fist, saying, "Let's, go Springboks." And you had every white Afrikaner in America, in the South Africa's heart melting and saying, Nelson Mandela can't be bad if he's for the Springboks. So he was shrewd about finding things that could unite people, and maybe avoiding those things that cause difficulty or argument or controversy. And I think in many cases, yes, Francois Pinoir, that as all of us as leaders, we have to try to find things that bring us together rather than things that separate us. And I think even in our politics, even as divided and polarized as our politics are, I think there are more things that unite us than divide us. And part of it is we just look at the same thing from different perspectives. And as a business person, you want to be in your customer's shoes and figure out how can I appeal to her based on what I know she likes, and I think that's a smart strategy, and it's also a generous strategy, and that's how Mandela saw it. I mean, he had a kind of a generous view of human nature that even a guy who'd been put in prison for 27 years. I mean, he basically believed that people were inherently decent, not that they were inherently evil.
He also had a type of composure. I remember reading the story about the airplane with the propeller not working, and him sitting reading the newspapers and everybody else being nervous, but he had such immense control. And I remember reading it and thinking, like, I don't think I could sit there as composed as he was, knowing that I'm in the air, things are practically out of my control, and then having that element of control. What do you think are some of the things that he would have used that helped him to control, like, that panic factor? Because, of course, as we look to his life and the lessons that you're sharing tonight to impart some of them into our lives, what are some of the things that you feel like he would have done that would have helped him maintain that type of composure, or at least externally? Because when he came off, he told them, like,
yes,
on the inside, I was terrified,
yes,
but on the outside, I was composed.
No, it's a great story, and he he was incredibly composed on the airplane, and I think at the end of the story, I was meeting him at the end of this trip, and he got off the airplane and he shook hands with this busload of Japanese tourists, and was smiling and happy, and then he sat down in the back of the car, and he turned to me and he said, "Man, I was terrified up there." And part of it, as I say, came from that prison experience where you couldn't show emotion, and the idea was, when he told that to me, I hearkened back to all the times that he had told me when he was on Robben Island that he was afraid, and I thought to myself, well, I even said to him, "You're Nelson Mandela, how could you be afraid?" And he said to me, "Richard, it would be irrational not to be afraid." And part of I think the secret in a way is acknowledging that you have the fear, right? I mean, you can go out of your head if you try to pretend that you're not scared. But if you say, "Yeah, this is a scary situation," the plane's in danger of crashing, it's quite reasonable and rational to be fearful. That in some ways can tampen down on your fear by acknowledging it. And so I think he had that capacity to both acknowledge his fear and then sort of publicly repress it. And I think part of what he, as a leader, he would say is that part of leading is demonstrating that you can handle something. So what he was doing is showing, well, you must stay calm by observing me, and I'm being calm. And that is leadership, even if you don't feel particularly calm. And I think that idea of internalizing the idea that you're a leader makes you behave better. He had a lovely saying that he used to say to young people, that all leaders have one thing in common, and what that is the willingness to lead, is the willingness to step forward and say, "I'm going to take responsibility for that." That's an absolutely important thing that that leaders do and human beings should do. So when you do take that responsibility, you have to demonstrate it and demonstrate that you're worthy of it, even if it sometimes doesn't feel so good. I think that's what you would say.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's amazing. So on a personal level, just because I'm curious, how did this experience change your life?
Well, I met my wife, who's a fantastic woman. Each of my sons is kind of a godson of Nelson Mandela. The thing, working on the book, I had this extraordinary experience. I had the great experience, of course, of being with him for day in and day out for a couple of years. But then when I was working on the book, I also had the experience of internalizing all of these ideas of Nelson Mandela, the persona of Nelson Mandela, his self-control. I don't think I was ever a better person than when I was working on Long Walk to Freedom, because I internalized those things and his virtues. And in a way, that's why I wrote the book, so that other people could try to internalize them too. And of course, he would be the first person to say, no one should have to go through what I went through in order to attain the virtues and the self-control that I attained. But one of the reasons we did Long Walk to Freedom, and then one of the reasons I did Mandela's Way, is to kind of try to promote those ideas and have people understand them without having to suffer the consequences that he had to suffer. And he learned it by experience, but he wanted to teach people by telling them about his experience. And I hope people can take something away from the book. But I think it's, in terms of what I said before, this idea of being able to change your mind is something that has always influenced me. This idea that you have to, when you're in a leadership position, that you have to demonstrate those values and show those values to be deserving of it is important. I think the idea of empathizing with people, of not just leading for your most rabid supporters, but leading for the people who oppose you as well, is a powerful lesson that all leaders, and I wish our leaders in the U.S. would understand as well.
I think this discussion is so potent tonight because we're getting so many keys in terms of leadership that aren't really discussed. Some of the things that stood out to me so far is that you said in South Africa, they had a different style and a different type of governance as opposed to Western, where they would listen to all views and then have to find a path between all of them. And I think that's a lesson that all of us can embody in terms of sometimes we have our own personal prejudice because of what has been passed down from generation. And we're not open to other ideas and other views. It is when we're exposed to people like you who now show us through writing your books, through walking the steps that you have walked, that there are alternative paths and alternative ways. And I like that you said internalize the fact that you are a leader, and a leader operates differently because you are a leader of all, not a leader of those that you like or those that look like you, right, or those that sound like you. And it's amazing that I'm in Trinidad. We have Elaine, who's in South Florida, originally from Costa Rica, and then we have you, and then we are all able to merge life lessons and virtues and learn from it. I want you to share, like, in terms of us as millennials, what are some of the things that you would want us to take away as leaders of tomorrow that can stay with us even tonight, that we can adopt some of these things that you have seen that we can take on as leaders of tomorrow?
Yes. So, one of the things that I actually write about in Information Wars is cognitive biases. So cognitive biases, there's another great book by a social scientist who won actually a Nobel Prize in economics, Daniel Kahneman, Thinking Fast and Slow. And he's sort of the founder of behavioral economics. And behavioral economics is about how we operate irrationally most of the time in our choices and what we think, and that we have all of these cognitive biases that influence us. So, like, the most famous one is confirmation bias, which is that we welcome information that we agree with, and we don't really hear or listen to information that we don't agree with.
Wow.
You know, one of the things that I would say for millennial leaders who are, you know, more sophisticated about this is like, try to understand your own biases, right? I mean, figure out what you do believe and what you're not listening to because you're biased against it, and try to be open to it. And I think part of the problem is that we live in these kind of cocoons of confirmation bias where we're getting information that we agree with because we can get it. It's now, you know, it's pulling information rather than information being pushed at you. Excuse me. And that we have to try to get out of these cocoons and silos and listen to other people. I think would be a strong lesson for millennials, and I'm actually very confident that millennials can figure it out. I think they are more open-minded than my generation, which is the baby boom generation, and I think trying to understand where we do things because these ideas have been inculcated in us and their tradition, rather than something that is actually rational or different. I mean, I kind of hate it when I hear people say, and I know this is going to sound awful, when they say that's the way I was raised or that's what I was taught. Albert Einstein once said that common sense are those bad ideas that you were taught before the age of 13. And what I just think, and of course, there's a lot of good stuff that you're taught too, and I hope like my children, but what I mean is to go back and try to think about those things that you believe just because you were taught them that don't necessarily make sense versus things that you believe because they do make sense. And I think millennials can do that in a way that I think older generations can't.
Yeah, I think it's easier if you detach the emotion from the thought. So if you have generally a thought, right, if you attribute to it an emotion, then it becomes like you personalize it. So you kind of have to disconnect the two from this is information and this has nothing to do with who I am as a person. That way, if you change your mind, like you were saying before, then it's not that big of a deal. I just changed my mind. It doesn't change who I am in the core. It just means I changed my mind. Yeah. Exactly.
No, that is a good lesson. And I think, a larger lesson, I mean, if people can't change their minds, I mean, look how, at least in the US, how incredibly divided the country is. And it's like, well, if nobody's going to change their mind, we'll just be divided forever. So, Mandela always taught that there was often a middle ground. I mean, that there was nothing wrong with compromising, and that often the best results come from compromise.
Wow. I want to open up now, Richard, for those who may have questions. I know Elaine and I have been going at it, and I know that we have some participants online, both on Facebook and on the webinar with us tonight, that may have some questions, because we've all been on this journey of transformation together. I would say that this book has truly transformed the way that we think, and we're not even done yet. We're just on chapter 8.
Okay.
So I'm gonna open up now to see, do you guys have any questions? Please drop them in the comments below so that we can start engaging Richard with your questions. Let me see if we have any questions. Elaine, I guess we can get ours in while they are still typing, right?
Oh, wow. So, I mean, it's so much. What are some of the big differences that you observed as far as culturally from being an American living in South Africa?
Yeah, so it's it's very funny that, not funny, haha, but curious. So, I mean, obviously the U.S. has, the original sin of slavery and prejudice against African Americans and the years and years of segregation, which really only were remedied in the 60s and with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, et cetera. But what you have in South Africa is a strange kind of topsy-turvy world compared to the U.S., which is that Black South Africans are the majority, whites were only 10 or 15% and repressed the African majority. So it's just it's an astonishing situation, one of the greatest evils of the 20th century. But when you're there, I first went when apartheid still existed in the 1980s, and it was not a pleasant place to be. I mean, it was a police state. It was an authoritarian state. The small handful of white leaders were in control of the black majority. One of the extraordinary things that Nelson Mandela did was usher in this era of democracy, where it was one person, one vote, so that the African majority became the leaders of the country, and of course are the leaders of the country today. For all of its problems, it feels like an immensely healthier place than it felt like when I first went there in the 1980s. It's not repressive. You see black and white mingling in a way that you never saw before. The inequities are less severe. It's a much healthier place, although it still is a place that has a lot of problems.
Wow. There's a lot of debates, and people always ask these questions: are leaders born, are leaders made? And a lot of us looking on, are maybe aspiring leaders or influencers in our own right. How do you believe that you can get buy-in? I know you shared about Mandela now approaching different cultures, different people. As a leader, how do you get buy-in from your team for the common goal, for the common vision, for the common mission?
Yes, I mean that was an interesting issue, because for Mandela, he often believed in things that other members of his team didn't. So he had a small
Wow.
group of people around him, and he used to follow that same technique that I described when he listened to the Prince when he was a young man. I would sit in on some of these meetings, and he would listen to everybody, and then he would kind of summarize things in the end. But there were times when he, was kind of on his own about something, and I did see him, compromise and go with the Democratic majority in the meeting. I mean, that was the African National Congress. That was their principle, that it was never going to be a one-man party. It was a party of group leadership. There were times that I think he did. There was a kind of a majority of one where he said, we're going to do it this way, and because he was Nelson Mandela, they agreed. But most of the time he compromised, and he went with the feeling of the majority. And I think one of the things in our culture that I think is actually harmful is, you hear people saying it at commencement speeches, like, never give up, never let anybody dissuade you from your point of view. I mean, if people never gave up, we'd have a lot worse planet than we have now. Sometimes I remember once when I've been in several leadership positions, and I remember once a kind of a wise advisor to me said, when you go over to the other side, you're going over to the winning team. So it's like, and I thought, wow, that's a very powerful idea, because the thing is, maybe it isn't exactly your idea, or maybe you disagree with it, but if the majority goes for it, you go over there, and then you become the leader of the majority view.
Yeah.
And there's so many things that I think we can be doctrinaire about, where actually, as another leader that I admired, one of my bosses at the time used to say, like, well, I can argue it round or square. And there's a lot of things like that you can argue it round or square. And maybe if, even if you prefer the round version, maybe you should go for the square version, or vice versa. So I think being doctrinaire, being authoritarian about your views is just not a healthy or a good thing for any leader to do.
Wow, I think that was a good lesson. One of our viewers online is asking, does Richard speak any other languages?
Well, I speak really terrible high school French. I learned a little Afrikaans in South Africa, and my wife and I will sometimes speak that. I am from New York and grew up in New York, so I speak a little, I speak, as we say here, Dorman Spanish. So, but I'm pretty monolingual, unfortunately.
Wow. Well, I guess since we don't have any more questions here on the chat, I can ask my own, right? So when I think of Nelson Mandela and reading about him, how he led from the front by being an example, led from the back, how he listened to people, empathized with, basically with the enemy, and how he used the stories to drive a point and connect with people that were actually accusing him. I just cannot help but go into the parallel of comparing Nelson Mandela with like Jesus Christ. Was he a man of faith at all?
I'm always a little bit delicate about this because I hate to disappoint people, but he was not a man of faith. And I do think the parallels between Mandela and Jesus or Gandhi or Muhammad or the Mahatma, are very similar. I think all of the great religions have this very similar principle: do unto others as you would have others do unto you. And absolutely, that was, in a way, that was the thing that turned Mandela into a leader. When he went to Johannesburg, when he ran away when he was 19 years old from where he was living with the prince, he'd never really experienced prejudice before. And, as I say, he was this kind of magnificent, young fellow. And suddenly he was being treated in the most awful way. And he was being spat on. And, people assumed he couldn't read and couldn't speak English and all of these things. He was being treated abominably. And that actually turned him into a revolutionary, because he didn't think anyone should ever be treated like that. And that was his kind of road to Damascus, as it were. He was, I think, a spiritual person. He was driven by the moral rectitude of what he believed, that yes, he was willing to compromise, but he wasn't willing to compromise on the great virtue that was the story of his own life, of achieving freedom for his own people. He would do different things to get to that, but that was indisputable. That was never in question, that he had to bring freedom for his countrymen. So, he may not have been religious, but I worship Nelson Mandela. How about that?
That works.
Oh my goodness. And Richard, I think we've heard so much about the lessons from Mandela. As we close in our last 5 minutes, I want us to be your students now, and let's get the lessons from Richard. We've talked for like 45 minutes going on the lessons that we've learned from Mandela's way and all the things that his life represents and how we can become better leaders. But I know there's also the book of Richard. So I think we're going to be your students for the next 5 minutes, and tell us some of the lessons that you have personally learned that you would want to share with us, that we can get some principles from your life.
Yes. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate that. And, some of the lessons are lessons that I've adapted, of course, from Nelson Mandela. And the times that I've been in leadership positions, being a leader is not easy. The Shakespeare line, heavy is the head that wears the crown. There's a lot of responsibility. But I just keep coming back to, when you're leading an organization, however big or however small, and whenever I did that, I thought, well, I spent a lot of time as an employee and not a boss. And I always came back to, how did I like being treated? How did I want the people above me to treat me when I was an employee? I wanted people to give me responsibility. I wanted people to respect what I was doing. I wanted people to guide me and say, this is the direction we're going in, but you figure out how to get there. so when I became leaders of different organizations that I've had, I always tried to embody those things that I felt when I wasn't the head of the organization. And, you know, in a funny way, I remember thinking when I became editor of Time, you know, I was just almost 50. And I remember thinking, you know, when I was 35, I had all the same ideas that I have now. It's just that no one took a chance on me and no one was willing to take a risk on me. And part of the thing about leadership is I also think it's about taking a certain amount of risk and also taking a risk on the people that are working for you and say, you know what, I don't know, I may not agree with her about everything, but like, I'm going to let her do it. Because when you take away initiative from people, they don't perform as well. And I think, you know, people that are underneath you, it's like, I want to be given a chance. If I fail, that's fine. You can, you know, remonstrate with me, but give me a chance. And then when I was a leader, I always tried to do that, even when I didn't necessarily think that, yes, helping others to grow. Even when I didn't necessarily agree with what that person was doing, I thought, I need to give her a chance. I need to let her explore. I need to let her make her own mistakes or achieve her own victories. And I think that's super important. And I think you know, I also, you know, played sports, you know, when I was growing up and played sports in college. And I had a coach who was just a fantastic coach. He preached unselfishness. And I think leaders need to be unselfish. You can't hog the ball. You can't claim credit for everything. And I think there's too many leaders in this modern era that we're seeing around the world where it's like, you know, I did, you know, like where they take credit for everything. That's not good leadership. Good leadership is giving credit to other people. You know, the people I respect are the people who get up there and the first thing they do is thank everybody for all the hard work and the good work that they did, right? As opposed to saying, it's all me. I hate that style of leadership. And so those would be my lessons from when I was in leadership positions, some of which I learned through Nelson Mandela, but some of which I learned just through, you know, being in the trenches. And I'm, you know, like I'm sure all of you have been in both positions, and you know how you like to be treated. Leaders should treat people in a way that is respectful and makes them want to be guided by you.
Wow. I see people in the chat saying that that's so good. I want to thank you tonight for taking a chance on us because, I mean, this has definitely, I don't take any encounter by, you know, lightly. I don't take the time you took tonight to impart into us lightly. And I believe that we've truly learned some life lessons that can help us in leadership. A lot of people think that sometimes as millennials, we want to get rid of the older and we want to change everything and we want to remodel. But there are a lot of things that we can take, lessons of the past that can improve our style of leadership, our style of doing business, our life as individuals now. And I just want to say thank you so much, Richard, for being the person that you are, for saying yes tonight to pour into a group of people from all over the world. Like, we don't take your yes lightly at all. And we honor you tonight for sharing with us.
Well, Krisha, thank you so much. I mean, you guys are all lovely and you're a friend now. So please feel free to call on me for anything. You know, we're pals now. And if I can be helpful to you and the group or anybody else, I'd love to be. And, you know, I mean, when good leaders are out there, it's better for all of us. So that's what we're trying to achieve. So thank you very much for having me.
Wow. Elaine, I don't know if you have any closing words.
No, just thank you so much. It's truly been a pleasure. I know that you are a very accomplished man, and just to take the time, like Krisha said, to impart into our lives, it means a lot. Thank you for writing this book because I can truly say that it has changed my life. It has changed the way I think and the way I lead people. And so, yeah, thank you very much. And I hope that everything that you imparted onto us is multiplied and sent back to you as well.
Well, I hope that for all of you, Elaine. Thank you so much. Because you know, I love what you have to say about the book. And again, please count on me for help or guidance or whatever. I mean, it's a great group that you all have, and you have a noble purpose. And and you're moving toward it, and Godspeed.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Richard. Everybody's in the chat. It's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate you. Have a good one, everyone. Take
All right.
care.
Good night, everybody. Bye,
Good
Krista.
night. Bye-bye.